You're a clinical microbiologist and infectious diseases scientist. So what actually constitutes a superbug?
Well, this is a perfect question, Ben, because in reality, superbugs it's a generic word for the bacteria that are becoming super to combat antibiotics.
Mm-hmm.
And this superiority is actually emerged from the bacteria's ability to evolve and develop certain mechanisms to combat modern medicines such as antibiotics. Unfortunately, this evolution has actually tackled a lot of antibiotics, and hence we do have quite severe superbugs. And the main drive of this evolution, I think, is the actual use of antibiotics, whether for treatment or for abusive use. And I will go through this. So when I say treatment, of course, when you get sick, sometimes we take antibiotics, then this is necessary.
Yeah.
And it's important medicine that we really need to maintain and keep. But unfortunately, there's also a collateral damage that can associate with this. For every antibiotics that we consume, we are driving the bacteria to evolve and become resistant to the antibiotics.
Yeah.
Throughout the history of antibiotics, which is quite short actually, unfortunately, it's been about 60 years now since the discovery of antibiotics. We have witnessed a lot of antibiotics that have gone into the dome because they are not effective anymore.
Right.
And of course, the abusive use of antibiotics will expedite this. When I say abusive use of antibiotics, I'm referring here to the unnecessary use of antibiotics for medicinal purposes, such as, for example, when you have cold and flu, for example. We are in the cold season now. It's likely that a lot of people develop cold and flu, and these are the cold and flu are developed by or caused by viruses, which means they will not be impacted or affected by antibiotics at all. And hence, antibiotics here, the use of antibiotics in this context is unnecessary at all. Yet, it's very important to know that we as human beings only consume about 30% of the world antibiotics. There's 70% of the antibiotics that are being utilized in the agriculture industry. So there's a lot of antibiotics that used in the agriculture industry. Why is that? Because the global expansion of humanity is actually correlating with a global expansion of the need for food. And that's why there's a development of what's so-called the industrial agriculture, or industrial farming. We are not like the old days anymore, where a few people would have a few cows in their paddock, and they will have their milk every now and then, or their meat every now and then. In reality now, it's a very unfortunate situation where animals are kept in captivity in a very small contained environment and in a very large number to be able to grow quickly, get fed, and then those are slaughtered and get sold in the market to match the consumer's need. But this environment where the animals are kept in captivity are, because they are in a small place next to each other and so on, there's a huge chance for them to develop infections.
Right.
And antibiotics in this context is actually being utilized as a preventive medicine, or what's called prophylactic, with the aim to prevent infections that can occur. Coincidentally, however, while that was being utilized, it was demonstrated we don't really know the exact reason behind this outcome, but it was discovered coincidentally that if you provide antibiotics to animals, they will gain weight. So perfect. So antibiotics then have dual purpose, which is being prophylactic as well as growth promoters. And the animals are fed antibiotics in this case, of course, wrongly, to prevent infections in animal, as well as to get them to gain weight quite quickly. So of course this is a typical example of abusive use of antibiotics. And you know, I think the talk I will be giving today is quite important because it demonstrates, or it pitches the idea that antimicrobial resistance, the issue of antimicrobial resistance, is very much like climate change. Why is that? Because when you are driving your V8 vehicle, for example, your carbon emission can impact on the entire world. If you're having, and that's exactly how it's like with antibiotics, because if every antibiotics that we get to use, we can develop superbugs, and that can actually impact other people's health. And this is exactly the same context with climate change. Your action can have an impact on the globe, and same with antibiotics. Your action of abusive use of antibiotics can have an impact on the globe. And I would like to see a global action the same way how it is like with climate change to combat antimicrobial resistance, of course.
So you're saying that it poses a huge threat? Absolutely.
On a global threat. Well, there's the forecast for 2050 that the annual mortality rate that caused directly by antimicrobial resistance is about 10 million deaths annually.
Right.
That will take over the deaths of caused by road traffic accident alongside cancer.
Really?
Yeah.
And is it new diseases that are showing resistance, or is it existing ones that are known killers?
Well, even very typical bacteria like E. coli, for example, which we always have in our gut as a normal flora, and sometimes can cause infections. For one of the most common infections caused by E. coli is UTI. About 30% of the world women at least have developed one UTI in their lifetime, which is urinary tract infections. So this is an example of a very typical bacteria that can cause an infection that is very hard to be treated sometimes. But this is not the only challenge, Ben. I think there's a huge challenge because to date we are relying a lot on antibiotics for modern medicine.
Yeah,
I'll explain this even better. Because of antibiotics, we became able to perform transplantation surgeries, for example, to prevent post-operative infections because of antibiotics. So imagine if these antibiotics are not effective anymore, the modern medicine will collapse.
Yeah,
simply, and that's why when I say the accumulative deaths related to antimicrobial resistance can be quite significantly high, is not directly because of the direct infection that cannot be treated, because there's a lot of other operations that depend on antibiotics, which or medical practices that depend on antibiotics will not actually be will not work anymore.
And why are we struggling to develop new ones, say?
Perfect question. So we can develop new ones or discover new ones, but it's a very complicated situation here we put ourselves in. The time it takes to develop and discover and purify and so on antibiotics, it takes a lot of time and money.
Yeah.
For research and development. But once those products become available to be tested for clinical practice, i.e. go through the phases of clinical trials, that can take up to a decade and nearly $1 billion of funding.
Wow.
Now, what is the problem? Despite the fact I just told you that there's an increasing number of antimicrobial resistance around the world, the portion of those that are really resistant to antibiotics and need the new drugs that we get to develop in comparison to the larger number of infections is quite small.
Okay.
So our problem really is the denominator. Our denominator is huge, which are the world infections. Part of that are bacterial infections. Part of that are the antibiotic resistant ones, and part of that is the multi-drug resistant ones, and even smaller is the ones that are pan-drug resistant, which need the new drugs. So, and hence, that is actually, that small number is not encouraging for pharmaceutical companies to continue.
Yeah.
What actually what is gutting as well, last year in April and in December, 2 pharmaceutical companies have filed bankruptcy because they could not sell enough antibiotics.
Wow.
In 1 year. And that was dramatic. When I saw this, that made me really sad, because I do really appreciate the need for having new antibiotics. Yet, unfortunately, the current economical model for how antibiotics are being developed and regulated, etc., until they make it to the market and being sold, is quite dramatic. Because, you know, when you are taking statin, for example, or for any of the chronic infections, the ongoing ones, usually these drugs are being sold nearly for life. If once the condition, the chronic condition is covered. This is not the case with antibiotics. It's short term, and the likelihood of an individual to develop infections is quite small throughout their lifespan. So, I can't remember how many times I have taken antibiotics, but I think I can count them on my 2 hands. And the course is usually about 7 days.
Yeah.
So not only the proportion of people who would need the infections, the number of infections is small, but also the amount of antibiotics that will be taken by those individuals is even small. So unfortunately, the current economical model for developing and selling antibiotics is not really encouraging for pharmaceutical companies, and hence, there's, as I mentioned earlier, some have filed bankruptcy, and other mega pharmaceutical companies have actually decided to step down from this business.
Right.
And we are just left at the dark, because we do need antibiotics. As I mentioned earlier, the current modern medicine is highly dependent on antibiotics. And if that is not being solved, then we're going to face a huge challenge in the very near future. One of the proposals on how we can solve this is, of course, by having public funding to support the research and development, as well as the regulation for antibiotics, as well as to subsidize a lot of the costs for development of antibiotics as well. And that's why the UN has put antimicrobial resistance as one of the important threats for humanity, alongside climate change, and we're very pleased with that. The G20, for example, which is approaching here in Saudi Arabia this year, is actually very much considering antimicrobial resistance as one of the threats that the G20 have to put at the forefront to be combating. But I think most importantly, we really need to prevent, or first of all, look for alternatives for antibiotics.
Yeah.
And one of the most important alternatives is to prevent actual infections. If you prevent the infections, there is a huge chance that you wouldn't need the antibiotics. And of course, prevention here starts with the proper infection control practices, which are highly dependent on rapid diagnostics. You really want to know the infection once it strikes.
Yeah.
You want to contain it as soon as it occurs, before it's spread to other individuals, and hence rapid diagnostics are really vital as well.
And moving to you specifically, you're obviously leading research in this area, but it's taken you to some interesting places in the world, including exploring the caves of Venezuelan savannah. How did that come about, and why?
It's beautiful. When you think about caves are really windows to the past. They are sealed places that rarely touched by a human being or other creatures. Yet they are highly infested with microbes, as like any other place in the world. So there are two aims or objectives that I would like to gain out of my exploration in caves. One, I would like to understand how superbugs have evolved over the time. And to be able to do so, we really need to get a time machine, travel back to the past, go and collect the old-time microbes and compare them to the new ones. In the presence of caves, we don't really need to do this, because caves can be a representation to the past. The existing microbes in caves, we hypothesize that they never had any contact with humankind, neither modern medicine or antibiotics, and hence they might be representing the old-time microbes that are still pristine, if you would. And when we compare, and hopefully when we compare their genetics makeup as well as other components, we will be able to understand how superbugs have evolved to the menace that is affecting us to date. The other thing as well, because it's a polymicrobial ecology, which means a lot of microbes are living in a harmony, really, in those environments. Not necessarily in a harmony, but also sometimes in competition. And when you understand the microbial ecology, you would understand that microbes can produce chemical compounds that would prevent other nearby microbes from overtaking.
Right. So they take out their rivals.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And that would to assure there is a nice balance of microbes that can share the same resources and share same place for years. Those chemical compounds can be form of new antibiotics that never been discovered before. And hopefully, because those places have never been discovered or accessed by humankind before, then potentially we will be able to discover new antibiotics that can help the future fight against antimicrobials.
Okay, and so what's first sparked your interest in antimicrobial resistance, and what do you hope for the field in the next 5 years? There's some big challenges there.
Well, one of the things I think, and as a clinical microbiologist, I have seen a lot of cases where bacteria really demonstrate resistance to antibiotics. And when you read the clinical stories behind these cases, they're quite sad. People who have been struggling a lot with infections. My mom, unfortunately, is struggling with recurrent UTI, and that is very touching because recurrent UTI meaning it's an ongoing infection that goes and comes back again with the same bacteria, and it's of course due to antimicrobial resistance, because the bacteria is not being killed by the antibiotics that she is receiving. And we have looked at cases where, or published actually some cases where patients have developed pyelonephritis or infection in the kidney, and then they can develop sepsis or bloodstream infections. So quite significant infections that have resulted from very simple infections such as UTI, and it escalated due to antibiotics is not effective. And that is a mission I have devoted my life for. I would like to be at the forefront fighting antimicrobial resistance in different angles. And that's why I'm very passionate about developing policies and being part of policy making to advocate for antimicrobial resistance to be at the highlight and considered by government, NGOs, as well as the private sector to be combated. I'm very pleased that I was part of several national, regional, international consortiums where we put together action plans to combat antimicrobial resistance. And this is one of the things I think is driving, hopefully, change in the area. But on a personal level, I'm also very much trying to advocate to the public as well. I would like to educate them about this issue, and that's why I'm very pleased, and thank you so much for hosting me at the podcast, to speak up and speak out about the issue of antimicrobial resistance, to try and educate the public about the threat and our unfortunate minimal chance to overcome this challenge. It's possible, but we need to put a lot of effort to overcome it, the issue of antimicrobial resistance, because epidemics can be right at the door front. Throughout the history of mankind, there was a lot of pandemics that has actually wiped out a lot of humanities. One of the famous one is actually the Black Plague in ancient Europe, where it actually has wiped out a lot of humanity in a very short period of time. And the Black Plague was caused by a bacteria called Yersinia pestis. That can happen at any moment, because the reason why Black Plague has happened and could not be controlled as if it would be today is due to the lack of antibiotics at the time. And we can go back to the era where antibiotics did not exist because of such an issue. Antimicrobial resistance would drive the bacteria to become to not respond to antibiotics, and that it's basically would reverse us back to that era. So yes, speaking out to the public through filmmaking, for example, and I'm very pleased to screen the movie that I was part of tonight at the cinemas at KAUST, to try and convey this message of science to the public in a very exciting and in a lay language that they can engage with. From a research point of view, in the next 5 years, I'm really hopeful that we will be focusing more on developing rapid diagnostics that can help patients to be identified quite quickly for being for being infected with antibiotic-resistant bacteria or any other infectious diseases, so we can act quickly to prevent the spread of this infection. If we can successfully do so, hopefully we can reduce the number of people who would be impacted significantly by such a crisis.
Okay, thank you so much for your time. That was a fascinating discussion.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Ben, for having me.
Thank you.